In this video, we're going to look at how we're going to bring our infographic together in Illustrator. And the reason I'm starting on this particular screen is this is a sketch, or you might even call it a wireframe for an infographic. It's really important that you start with a sketch, and it can be as hand-drawn as this example, or it can be, if it is a more complex infographic, you might want to use software and put together something that is a little bit more specific in terms of layout, sizing, font. This is a great example site because we get to see the wireframes, and these are very high fidelity wireframes, and how they translate into the final infographics. But you definitely want to start with a sketch, and you definitely want to ensure that your sketch is the right proportion, the right size for the infographic that you're going to create. Size is going to be very important when it comes to laying out your elements and especially fitting in your graphs. So I'm going to go into Illustrator now, and I'm actually going to make a new file. And the thing that you want to make sure when you're doing your final layout in Illustrator is that you know the right size of your infographic. This one we're definitely going to do for print, but it's not necessarily the case that your final infographic would be destined for print. It might be destined for web. The reason this is important is, of course, because web, I just clicked on web here, you'll get a different color profile. Let's assume that it's for print. So we're going to choose print. And you want to make sure that the width and the height is either what you've decided based on your sketch that your infographic is going to be, or that it's the correct measures that you've gotten from your client. In this case, we're going to work in millimeters. The typical infographic is usually, let's say it's usually about 210 by 490, kind of long and thin. So we're going to start with that. And again, it's for print, so we're using CMYK as our color profile. And we only need the one artboard for now. Once you've gotten your basic artboard in the right size for your infographic, the next thing you're going to want to do, I'm just going to close my layers menu. I don't really need it open. The next thing you're going to want to do is create guides. Now, the wireframes that we just looked at didn't include any guides, but I would always use some sort of software for my wireframing that would allow me to lay out my infographic on top of a grid. Typically on web, we use a 12-column grid. For this infographic, because it's very long and thin, we're going to use a 6-column grid. And what we need to do is add a layer called guides. In order to make my guides, I'm going to start by making a square. I'm just choosing the rectangle tool from the tools menu, and I'm going to try and get it as close to the edge as I can and bring it over so that it looks like it's centered. But I'm just going to go back to my black selection tool and just move it up and down a little bit. What I want is that I want to make sure that I get that pink dot in the center, so that I know that this center of my rectangle is in the center. I know that I want a 10 millimeter gutter on the side. So under this shape properties menu, I can go into the width and I can just minus 10, actually minus 20, because I want it on both sides, and it'll take it away from both sides. I'm just going to uncheck that so it doesn't take it away from the top and bottom, because it doesn't really matter. And now I know that I have exactly a 10 millimeter gutter on each side of my square. Now I'm going to want to drag the top of this square up so that it's sitting a little bit away from the top. And if I hold down Alt while I do that, it will drag both. And that would be Option on the Mac. So I'm holding that down. You can see as I drag, it's dragging from both the top and the bottom. So It doesn't really have to be exactly right from the top. I know that I want it to be about 10, whatever, that's fine. And I know that actually I want a little bit of extra space on the bottom for footer information, things like small print, copyright. Now, in order to turn this rectangle into guides, I need to make some columns. So I'm going to go into Objects. I'm going down to Path, and I'm going to split into grid. And the number of columns that I want is 6. So I've got my 6 columns. If this was a web project, again, I would probably use 12 columns and a different layout. But for this aspect ratio, for something that's long and thin, 6 columns is a good number of columns because it's divisible by 2, it's divisible by 3, by 6 as well. And the reason you want to use a grid, not only in your Illustrator file, but also in your wireframes, is just so that you can get that alignment right. You can make sure that everything aligns to the grid and everything aligns to something else in your layout. Now we also want to create a gutter. I'm going to turn preview on so that I can see that working. And we want our gutter to be also 10 millimeters. Now they're still not guides. In order to turn them into guides, we need to do something that we've done before. We made a line in our battery graphic a guide. And the way we did that was by making sure that our object, our paths were selected. And the shortcut is Command 5 on a Mac or Control 5 on a PC. So I just hit Command 5 and now I have, these are guides. If you mouse over them, you'll see that they are now guides. So the last thing we need to do is lock these guides. Now, if we didn't want to use the keyboard shortcut, you can also turn something into guides by going in the View menu, go down to Guides, and Make Guides. We can't choose it because they're already made, but we're just going to lock them. So now we can draw on top and our guides will stay put, and they'll just allow us to make sure that we align everything to a grid. The next thing we're going to talk about is how do I get my color palette and my text styles into Illustrator. I would always recommend that before you start your project, you generate a style tile. And what I have open here is a file called styles.ai. You can find a template for this in the exercise files, and it's a file that you can use in Illustrator to essentially determine all of your fonts, font colors, and all of your palette colors. This is really handy if you're using a palette that's coming from a client, especially if you're using fonts that come from a client. You can set everything up in this file and then import it into your project. Now, you might be determining your color palette on something like a color brewer. What's great about Color Brewer and really many of the other palette generation sites out there is that once you've created your palette, you can export it for Illustrator. So let's just get a few more colors here. I'm going to pick a different color scheme, and we want CMYK, and I would like a few more than 3. 6 is probably too much. As we said, you really don't want a palette that goes for more than 7. Let's just dial that back to 5. And now I can just click this export button, making sure that I have CMYK chosen. I can click export and I can download a number of different file types here. What I want to do is download an Adobe Swatch Exchange ASE file. And I can go back into Adobe and I can import. Now I'm going to open up my swatches in Adobe, and I'm going into my Swatch Libraries menu. I just chose Other Library, and now I can open up my ASE file. Once I've imported this library, it is available to me from the drop-down in my Swatch Libraries menu. If I want, and it's hard to see because it's off the screen, but I do see it as being choosable. There's a lot of work you can also do in Adobe to create your color palette. And that's in the color menu. It's at the very top. You have color, color guide, and color theme. So if I click on one, let's just click on color, you'll also get color guide and color themes in these tabs. So I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. So for color, you can essentially mix colors. So you can pick colors from anywhere in the spectrum, and as I'm choosing with the dropper, you can see it appears up here. I could add it to my swatches and it appears down here. So you can work that way to develop a palette. Not really the most effective way of developing a palette because you really have no idea if those colors are going to work together. So let's have a look under color themes. Now, when I click on color themes, what it's doing is it's looking for my Adobe ID. The reason it's doing that is because what I would see under this menu is anything that I've made on color.adobe.com, any palettes I've favorited on a color.adobe.com. So let's go there. So I have a bit of a palette here and I just want to favorite it or save it to my library. I'm going to save it as Client Palette 1. Save it into my library. I could create new themes. In theory, these themes should be available to me in Illustrator. And I'm just going to refresh. It seems to not be synchronized quite yet with my Creative Cloud account. So we're going to develop our theme right here. So I'm going to go into the Color Guide panel. And you can see that the color that I have selected here has been set as the base color. If I want to edit the colors, I can open this color wheel and you'll see that it's similar to what we were just seeing on Adobe, where I can move these around. I can look at different kinds of color groupings. There's the a web color group that would work with these colors. And what's great about this whole functionality is that it's meant so that these colors will work together. Now, we don't even really need to work too much in here. That's our base color there. If we want, we can pull it around a little bit. We can move that in. We get a little bit more of a muted palette. I'm going to click OK. And I can save all of this to my color group. Now, what's also great about Adobe is once I'm in here in this color group, I see all kinds of different shades and tints. So in other words, this is my base palette right here. This is exactly the same as this group of colors. It's just been flipped to be displayed vertically. And as I go towards the left, I see what the color is like with the addition of black. As I go towards the right, I see what the color is like with the addition of white. So I can look at these colors other than as shades and tints. There's a menu right here, little panel menu. If I click on it, I can also look at the variations that would be warm and cool. And again, I have my palette down the middle. I could see what it would look like if it was more vivid or more muted, still with my palette down the middle. Now right now I have only 4 colors on either side. That's the default, but I can change that. If I click again on that little panel menu, I can go to Color Guide Options and have 5 steps, 6 steps. Now again, we have a lot of colors here and we absolutely do not want to use all of these in our palette. But what we can now do, we know that all of these colors are going to work together. If I hold down the Command key, and click on colors, I can pick a different palette. And then I can save this color group to my swatch panel. If I go into my swatches, there they are. And finally, if you did do all of your palette work in color.adobe.com, let's go to my theme, and you're finding that it's not synchronizing into Illustrator, you can always export or download your palette as an ASE file. And then of course I can go into Illustrator, open up my swatches menu, and I'm going all the way down to Other Library, and it's going to allow me to open up that library. And now this Client Palette 1 will be in my library list. I have a file open now. It's called 04_start. It is in the exercise files, and it's just a file with some basic background information already in it. Now, there are guides in this file, but we can't see them right now. If you do open your file and you find that you can't see the guides, just check in the layers menu, and I can see in my layers menu that I have guides as a layer. My background layer is also locked, but I'm not seeing my guides. The little eye icon is not showing here. So I'm just going to click on it so I can see my guides. Now what we're going to do is add some graphs to this infographic. And it's important that you add your graphs at essentially the right size. Now what we're going to do is add a graph down here. We're going to use some Excel information. So what we want to do is click on our rectangle tool. We want to make a rectangle that is as close as we can get it to the size of our graph. So I'm using my guides. I've just dragged across, and now I have this rectangle. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to fill it with a color. Doesn't really matter what color, just so I can see it. So I've just filled it with a color now. And I'm going to delete it by doing Command X. Then I'm going to make a new file by doing Command N. And this is just going to be a print document. Anything small will do. It doesn't really matter. I'll just grab that. And I do want it to be in the landscape orientation. I'm going to create that. And I just did Command V to paste my rectangle. So I know that this rectangle is the right size for my graphic, for my chart. So now I'm going over here to my artboard tool so that the artboard is chosen. I'm just going up to this presets menu, and I'm going to fit to selected art. So now my artboard is the exact size that I want the graphic to be. I don't really need this rectangle anymore. So I just deselected my artboard by selecting the black selection tool. I'm going to click on my red rectangle and delete it. So now this artboard is exactly the right size for the graph that I want to create. So I'm going to click on my graph tool, and I'm holding down. What I want is a line graph. Now I'm going to drag on my artboard. I know that I pretty much want it to fill this area, but I do want to leave a little bit of room for numbers. So I'm going to do that. I'm leaving just a little bit of room. I don't need to worry about the legend because we're not going to be including the legend on our final infographic. Now I just let go, and of course I have my data panel open here. What I'm going to do is copy paste some Excel data into this data panel. Just opening up Excel, and I have a file called speed opened. And again, when working with actually creating your charts in Illustrator, it's important to work with fairly simple data sets. This is going to be a fairly simple line chart. So I'm just going to grab all of this in Excel. I'm copying. I'm going back into Illustrator and I'm pasting. Now if I click apply, I can close that. I have 2 line charts, which is what I was looking for. So now before we bring it back into our infographic, we're going to do a little bit of cleanup and just make it look a little bit better. So the first thing we're going to do in our cleanup, I'm going to move it down a little bit. It was kind of going off the screen. And I think I can even move it over to the right. So I'm just moving it a little bit to make sure that my numbers are on screen. Now, if I want to do things like change the color of the numbers, I absolutely will want to be working with my palette. If you go over to the right, there's a libraries menu, and you recognize it by the little Adobe Creative Cloud symbol. If I click on that, I actually see my client palette here. So that's great. That's going to be available to me. Just going to close that again for 1 second so we can see what we're doing a little bit. I'm first going to want to recolor my axis and my numbers. So I want to make sure that my white direct selection tool is chosen, and I'm just going to option click just on the numbers. So I'm going to option click again. Now all of my numbers are chosen, but I have access to changing their color. So I'm actually going to change them to gray. I'm going to kind of gray them down. And I'm going to do the same for my axis. Now the axis is not fill, it's actually a stroke. So I'm just going to go into my stroke and similarly gray it down. I'm going to want to choose my key. Again, I'm just going to control with my white selection tool chosen. I'm going to option click on just the word max. If I click twice, I get both words, and I'm actually going to make the fill and the stroke transparent. I'm going to do the same thing here. It just makes our legend invisible. Now we could do a lot of work to recolor the rest of this graph, but for now what I want to do is just show you a way that we can bring our numbers right into the markers on the graph. We've already seen how we can change these markers to be another symbol, but what we're going to do now is make sure that the actual numbers appear on the markers. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit so we can see what we're doing a little bit more easily. So in order to do what we're about to do, we need to copy one of these markers. So I have my white selection tool chosen. I'm just going to option click on one of the markers. I'm going to copy it and I'm going to paste it. I'm just going to move it over here so it's off of the artboard. I'm just going to zoom in a little bit more. And what we're going to basically be doing is making another design, but we're going to be using a little bit of code to make it, rather than a different graphic, it's going to actually show our graph numbers. So the first thing we want to do is make this have no fill and no stroke. And it's hard to see it because it's going off the screen, but I'm just clicking the no fill, no stroke. So now this is a copy of my marker and it's essentially invisible. So now I'm going to get my ellipse tool. If I hold down on rectangle, I can find it right there. And what I want to do is make it so that it goes right from the middle. So I've just positioned my cursor right over the middle of my square invisible marker. And if I hold down Alt or Option while I drag, I'm going to make a circle that's just about the same size. I want it to maybe be a little tiny bit bigger. and that looks fine. Now I'm just going to drag over both so that they're both selected so I can see what I'm doing. So I see that my circle is just a little bit bigger, so that's about right. Now I'm going to want to fill my ellipse with color. I'm just going to Command or Shift click on the square to deselect it. So now I just have my circle chosen and my fill is chosen here. I'm going to go up into my swatches and pick one of my client colors. Now I have a green circle and it's positioned right over my marker. Now if I choose my type tool and I just click, I'm going to fill some placeholder text. I'm going to have some placeholder text popped up. Now this is way too big. We really only need 3 characters. So I am just going to go in here and let's just bring that down quite a bit. Let's see if 6 points. Still a little bit big. Let's just try 4 points. And I really only need, as I said, 2 characters. So what I'm going to type here is %00. I'm going to move that. Still a little bit big. What I could do is make my circle a little bit bigger. Let's see how that works. Now I'm going to want to choose everything. I'm going to go to my object menu, down to Graph and Design. When I click New Design, I can see my circle with the %00 typed in it. I'm going to give it a name, Line Marker, and choose OK. Let's just zoom back out so we can see everything. I'm going to click on, just going to choose that white arrow. I'm going to Option click twice so that I choose that whole data range. Now I'm going to go into the Object menu, back down to Graph, and Marker, and choose the line marker. So I'm just zooming in on my marks. My size of text is fine, but I do believe I need to center my text in its bounding box. So I'm going to go back in and do that, but I did want to point out that if you want your measures to actually appear on your marks, which we could do with a bar, with any of the markers, as they're called in Illustrator, on our line graphs, we could do it with these. You go through that process of creating a new design for the marker, and you put this text in it. And I'm just going up here, I'm going to center it. Just get it back on there. Make sure everything is selected again. Going to delete that one. Grab my new one. Let's go back into our line. Going to click outside to unselect. I'm going to grab my white selection tool. And if I Option click once, twice, go back now into the marker, grab it, let's just click off. And if we zoom in, that was the issue. And we could now add to these labels if we wanted to include what this is a measure of. So the reason that we've done all of this, well, we've done this for two reasons. One is we want to make sure that our graph is a really specific size. The other reason is it's somewhat better practice to create these data-driven objects in Illustrator in separate files. So now we need to place this into our main file. We haven't saved it yet, so let's save it. Make sure I put it someplace. I'm going to put it someplace handy so I can get at it easily and quickly. All of these options are fine. Now we're going to go back into our document, our main document, and I can just go under File, click Place, and then I'm just going to find that. There it is there. I'm just going to click right there and click outside, and there is my graph. It is at the right size. It looks very small here, but it is the size that we wanted. And we can now move it up or down. We might move this up a little bit. Now, obviously, a lot of my color choices aren't the best for this background, but in a real project, and I've forgotten to gray out my tick marks, in a real project you would be working with a palette. What I mainly wanted to show you was a couple of things. One is you probably want to make your charts in a separate file as we just did. One reason is, again, because you get the right size. The other reason is also it's a little bit easier to set this up for print and to manage this as a document when it's pulling in some of these heavier data-driven visualizations from another file. We're going to have a look at the appearance menu now and just go into a little bit more detail on how that can be useful to you, especially on an infographic project where you might want to determine specific styles and have them easily repeatable throughout your document. If, for example, we wanted a very specific look and feel to all of our icons, we would want to use the appearance menu to determine that, because it will help you to decrease a lot of repetition in the design and the styling that you do. What essentially it'll allow you to do is to style something once, and you essentially turn it into an appearance, and then you can apply that style to all kinds of different objects. Let's just grab an icon now. I'm opening up Noun Project. We've talked about Noun Project. If you haven't been using Noun Project, it's definitely worth looking into. I'm going to just grab this little film camera. In Noun Project, if I control click on it, I can actually copy it as an SVG. If I want to import that as an SVG, of course, SVG is not really an image. An SVG is a bunch of math. So what I need to do, I've just copied. Now I'm going to paste into this text file, and I'm going to save it as camera.svg. I'm going to remove the .txt extension. I'm just going to put it on my desktop so it's easy for me to find. Now I can open it. In fact, I could even place it. This is a vector graphic. If I shift hold, it's going to size proportionately, and now I have my icon. So I've moved my window over a little bit so we can see these icons. I've chosen my icon with the black arrow selection tool, and I can see that it has no stroke. So let's give it a stroke first. I'm going to be able to choose from this palette that I determined earlier on, and let's just give it say a 4-point stroke just so we can see it a little bit better. And I'm also going to give it a different fill. And I'm also going to want to put a circle around it. So I'm grabbing the ellipse tool. So I'm going to create a circle that's slightly larger than my camera. I can see now that it's a perfect circle right there. And obviously I don't want it to have the same fill and the same stroke, so it's chosen right now. I am going to go and give it a different fill color. Now we can move our window back over. I don't want this on top of my camera, so I'm just going to open up my layers here, and I can see that it is over top in this stack. So I just want to switch the order here. Now that I've done that, I can see that it's a little bit too small. And by holding down the Shift key when I increase the size of the circle, it will remain a perfect circle. So let's walk through a couple of examples of where we might use appearances. It's essentially a style definition for the way something appears so that you can apply it with a click or two to other objects. Now, in order to see how powerful appearances is, we might want to do a few other things to this object. Let's just grab the circle and let's go in and maybe we'll dial down the opacity. So I just dialed down the opacity on that. If I go into the appearance menu, I can actually see those styles as if it's a kind of layers. So if I target the fill here, if I just go into the effects menu, I can add maybe some texture. If I look under the effects menu, there's other effects that I can apply under stylize, things like inner glow. And if I just move that over and click on preview, I'll be able to see what's happening as I do it. So I have a few different effects applied here, and I don't want to go through all of this again and again and again. So if I want to save this, under graphic styles in the appearance menu, I can just drag the style in. And there it is. So now I can reapply this to other objects. So if we do import another icon, just try to make it roughly the same size. Now if I want to hold down the Shift key while I make this circle, just gonna need to do a little bit of positioning. Let's apply that appearance. Let's just have a look at our layers. We are going to need to move the TV over top of our new circle. So we'll need to go into our TV and give it that 4-point stroke and that orange fill. The final thing we're going to look at is how to output for print or web. When you are outputting for print, the best format is as a PDF because that can be brought into InDesign. It can be portable in a lot of different ways. It can be opened up again in Illustrator if you need to do any kind of minor modifications. So if we want it to save this for print, we go into the File menu and we're going to do a Save As. And really we just want it to be an Adobe PDF. Now, as soon as we click on Adobe PDF, we're going to get a lot of different PDF options. So let me just save that to somewhere on my desktop. And let's just walk through these a little bit. Usually you need to discuss this with your printer or whoever is going to be doing the production after you, but we'll just go through some of the standards. So I want to point out one thing. This is important. If this is going straight to print, if you're going to be taking this to a professional printer and they're going to want to print multiple copies, you definitely want to do marks and bleeds. I would tend to click off all printer's marks. This is really important because it allows the printer to calibrate their printer for colors. That's what the color bars are for. And it also allows the printer to then print your project on a larger sheet of paper and trim it back so that everything goes right up to the edge. So this is quite important. It's a step that often people miss if they're not used to preparing their work for print production. Now, if you look under the preset menu, you'll see that there's a lot of choices. So the mistake that often people also make is they just choose high quality print. Now, high quality print is fine, as it says right here in the description, for desktop printers and just for creating a proof, but it's not actually good enough for a professional print job. You would definitely want to choose press quality for that reason. You'll also notice that there's other PDF standards under this menu. So again, you might need to discuss this with your printer. You might want to choose one of these, but PDFX is the standard for graphic exchange. So again, you would need to discuss this with whoever is the recipient of this file to find out if there's something specific they want. Once you've chosen press quality, you make sure that your marks and bleeds are chosen. You can save that as a PDF. Now, I want to open that up and show you what the file looks like. So these are the printer's marks that you want to have on your document. There's the color registration that the printer will use to make sure that their printer is registered properly. And I'm not sure if I can't move this all the way up. Let's just zoom out. There's also some grayscale registration on the bottom. In order for this to print to be exactly right, using all the colors that you got from your client, it needs to be printed by a professional printer, and you want to include all of the color registration and print marks. If your infographic is destined to be a digital project, then it's probably going to be an image. So that's great. Illustrator supports a lot of different image export options. So if I go to the File menu, I'm not going to use Save As, I'm actually going to Export. If we go under Export As, we can, let's see if I can move that up a little bit. We can export it as a whole bunch of different file types, obviously PNG, but you can see that we can export it as a JPEG as well, a TIFF file, and even, I'm not going to be able to get this on the screen very easily, even as an SVG file. You can export it to Photoshop, in which case you would actually get a layered Photoshop or a PSD file based on the same layers inside your Illustrator file, or you can even flatten it before exporting or in Photoshop. Normally you would know what format the client would want. They would ask you specifically for a JPEG or a PNG, say. I'm going to try exporting as a JPEG because we'll see a few more options. So here you can see you have the color option. Typically, if this was already formatted in CMYK, you'd need to switch it to RGB. It's always a good idea to push the quality up as high as you can. It's fine if it's a larger file. You don't really need to worry about the compression method, but you might need to determine the resolution because Illustrator doesn't have a resolution of its own if everything you're dealing with is vector graphics. So you may need to set that resolution. And of course, you would need to consult with the people that you're producing it for to see what they're looking for. But you have a few choices here. Probably would want it to be high. And finally, we'll just have a look at that file. I can see here, just before I even open it, it's a fairly big file, 6.5 megs, probably too big for web, but this format is the highest possible quality, and it then gives the client or the webmaster the opportunity to res it down. We can see when we zoom in, we have a fairly high res file here. So it can be fairly time consuming to work through all of these steps to create your infographic in Illustrator, but you will have the most flexible output in terms of producing something that is suitable for print, for web. And again, the process generally is you want to start with a style tile, an external file of some sort that contains your palette and your text styles before you proceed to create your file with an artboard of the right size for your project. That's fairly important. You don't want to be doing sizing and proportions and relationships later. You want to start with an artboard that is the right dimension for the infographic that you wish to produce. And then you want to make your line charts in external files and pull them into your file one by one before you output for print or web.